So last week, we did hear from Carrie Lam saying now is the time to consider reviving the Hong Kong economy. But there are a lot of headwinds. Obviously, we're coming after the protests. We've had COVID restrictions and COVID to battle. We've had the national security law. These are a lot of challenges for this economy to overcome. How are we going to get to economic revival when the borders are still closed and we still have tight restrictions?
You're exactly right. Well, Hong Kong being one of the most internationalized and open city in the world, I think like many other cities, we are facing a lot of challenges. COVID hits everybody. And we also sort of, from the social unrest happened year before last, we're still sort of suffering from the sort of aftermath of the economic recession. But things are not entirely that gloomy. If we look at the figures for Q1 this year.
But they're coming off a low base last year. I mean, there was no activity in the first quarter.
Yes, and at first, back in January, February, I was saying that, well, that was a technical adjustment because, well, we compare with low base. But no, if you look at the trade figures in Q1, among the sort of 4 months out of 5, starting from last December, we have a historical record of total trade value exceeding 10 billion per month, which is unprecedented. Now, that's not all Hong Kong's doing. In fact, it's a reflection of the intra-regional trade and perhaps the hard effort we made in sort of easing some of the trade barriers within the region. Because here, we live in a more open and sort of competitive part of the globe in terms of trade. And trade figures speak for itself because, well, they will go through area where there will be a lower barrier. They will definitely go to where there is a market demand, and perhaps through Hong Kong because of the more efficient supply chain, not just movement of goods, but also services.
How are we going to get the movement of people, though, and get the borders open? Because to be an international financial hub, you need people coming in and out, right?
Exactly.
There doesn't seem to be, now correct me if I'm wrong, a government plan that has been made public to link the vaccination drive. If you hit X number of vaccination in population, will lead to X amount of relaxation of the quarantines and the opening up of the borders.
Yeah, everybody would like to have a magic figure or magic word saying that, well, if we hit a certain rate and a passing mark, and that everything will be sort of back to normal. Sorry, I don't think the world is heading in that direction. But in fact, like many other sort of governments, particularly a city government like Hong Kong, where we are so sort of dynamic and open, I think it needs a more comprehensive strategy from making sure that we have a strong public health in case anything goes wrong. You must have a full capacity to test every single suspicious case, which we are doing almost 100,000 tests per day within this tiny city, plus very strong and efficient tracking and tracing so that we leave no stone unturned. So, for instance, in Hong Kong, we don't even sort of do tests based on sewage findings. Now, so tracing all this, but of course.
But isn't chasing zero futile?
Now, we must aim to sort of have a zero infection because that's life and death. So every single case would need to be checked down. But having said that, there must be sort of a flexibility based on public health risk management. Now, take for instance the amount of energy, money, resources put into the test, where we can sort of test such a big number, and also sort of able to trace thousands or tens of thousands of people whenever there is a single case, is to minimize the risk of the community outbreak. I'll give you an example. In the last few days, we have one case of variants of concern, a lady and also her family. After having identified that case, we have already sort of traced over 10,000 sort of people who might be in close or slightly remote contact with them. Now, that's the resources we are putting in.
But it's one case, one, in a city of 7.5 million. Even Lee Hsien Loong, the Prime Minister of Singapore, has talked about we need to go into a new normal. I mean, there has to be an acceptance in a city like this that relies on international travel and commerce, which you're in charge of economic development and commerce.
Now, one must differentiate two things.
Sure.
For every single suspicious case, particularly those confirmed positive, there must be every effort to leave no stone unturned, right? And we have built up our resources. We have refined our sort of a way of tracing and tracking. But having said that, then, well, city would need to sort of go on as usual. Now look at Hong Kong, compared with many other sort of big cities. We never had a lockdown or curfew as such. There must be measures to allow certain degree of normalcy. Within the city, it's the social distancing, it's the different hierarchies of control, of access, whatever. And also going beyond Hong Kong, I think, well, your audience with most interest in when Hong Kong can be reopened.
Sure.
Right? Now,
when? Because what are the criteria? Because it has some of the strictest quarantine rules in place. For some destinations or arrivals from certain places, it's up to 21 days in a hotel. We know Hong Kong hotels are not cheap. So the ordinary person, again, gets squeezed and hurt, right? So what are the criteria to go from essentially zero infections right now, okay, to relaxation of the quarantines?
I think the answer is found in the list of countries where people coming from are subject to different level of quarantine, although they are all subject to more than 100% of testing, right? Now, for instance, we have now 4 categories of country where we impose this quarantine requirement. Of course, there are countries where we almost give a total ban, largely because of outbreak of the variant of concern, which a lot of countries are doing the same. Then we move to places of origin where we impose tougher control because of the outbreak situation there. So the quarantine requirement ranges from 7 days to 14 days to 21 days or to a total ban. I think all these are health-based. And we also keep on revising the list based on sort of communication between the health authorities.
But they're not all health-based because bankers and senior executives of listed companies are now can apply for a limited number of exemptions. And I'm sorry, a banker can be just as much of a carrier of COVID as an ordinary citizen.
Exactly.
So there are so it's not just health-based policies, and that's why the society is quite frustrated.
Exactly. Well, actually, we are talking about a very limited exemption scheme where since earlier last year, we do have exemption scheme on particular cases. For instance, recently we have sort of international cycling activities in Hong Kong. There were exemptions given to people who are allowed to come in, but were bubbled within sort of certain control. I think we are exploring various ways to see if there could be sort of a scheme where we can, based on health assessment, based on sort of sufficient protocol to sort of protect any sort of such risk. Then on that basis, give it a trial. Very much like down the list of more open and higher prospect of reopening, like the bilateral arrangement we are talking with, say, Singapore and some other country, where if we both feel very comfortable at the quarantine, at the COVID control situation, where we can do away with certain quarantine requirements.
So at what point, though, does being too safe make Hong Kong less attractive as an international financial hub? And I've talked to the bankers. Last week I was at the JP Morgan China Global Summit here in Hong Kong, talked to the Asia Pacific CEO, Filippo Gori, and he said Hong Kong in particular, but the rest of other parts of Asia, risk the, being secluded and segregated from the other main parts of the global economy because they're opening up quicker. So is Hong Kong risking being left behind?
Well, that's a constant question we ask ourselves every single day, particularly in my position. I need to balance economic sort of and business need. But
so what's the answer, though?
Well, the answer is the answer is not a single question of when and how, but we must base our decision on public health assessment. Now, I think there are certain sort of like silver lining in this. That Hong Kong has basically achieved a very, very low level of COVID outbreak.
That's achieved.
Yeah, that's by and large
achieved.
Yeah, that's achieved. Yeah, and secondly, I think but having that achieved, we must maintain the vigilance that we are not letting this to become another sort of a loophole, because we have seen other places.
Yeah.
No need to name these countries, but cities where enjoy a very safe situation could relapse. We look at around the world, the same situation. So that level of vigilance must be maintained. But at the same time, we are developing different schemes, largely on a bilateral basis, to see if there could be a prospect where things are being bubbled in a sense that we both feel safe within all these protocols. Now that would require testing. That would require eventually vaccination.
I want to talk about travel bubbles in just a second, but I want to get a sense from you, since I have you face to face here. What are the dialogues with mainland officials like? Is this Is this a mandate from Beijing saying, because they have a different requirements, and we had a mainland health official just yesterday say, listen, our criteria for opening up is very different than others, like the United States, and even acknowledged that they haven't seen the long-term efficacy of their own vaccines. So does Hong Kong fall under those similar type of sentiment because of Beijing's requirements? Hong Kong has different requirements, and they also have BioNTech. They also have Sinovac. Is this an indictment on your confidence or the government's confidence in the vaccinations?
Well, again, this is also one of the sort of indication of one country, two systems. That while within one country, we sort of maintain a slightly different system in terms of boundary control, and that's why we need to sort of talk with the mainland and Macau and other places over this sort of reopening of boundary. Now, on the mainland side, although, well, from Hong Kong's perspective, we always want this to be opened as the first place because, well, the connections, business or social.
So when will it happen? What are the criteria to open?
I think from the mainland perspective, you would appreciate that, well, they would be highly guarded because, well, their situation is hard-earned. Now, from the outbreak to the very good control they have maintained, and they have also put in a lot of resources. Now, the dialogue goes in such a way that, well, we need to keep our house clean. That's first and foremost. So Hong Kong must bring down the COVID outbreak, which we have.
That's where the frustration comes.
And therefore, the secondly, I think we are also allowing people to return on the unilateral basis, where Hong Kong residents are now allowed to come back from mainland without the quarantine. This is within our jurisdiction now, and so far we are glad to see that, well, there is no single case where we are seeing a community outbreak because of returnee from the mainland. Now we will be opening up to beyond Hong Kong residents, whoever coming back from the mainland, should they complete, say, a 14-day cycle, then they will be allowed to come back without the quarantine. Now, as to sort of negotiating on our access into the mainland, I think it depends on the situation between Hong Kong and our adjacent province like Guangdong.
What incentives are you working on to get vaccinated people either, some sort of benefit for being vaccinated? Are you working specifically on bubbles? Is Singapore going to happen again? I know Phuket's going to have a direct flight in July. Are these things that could be an incentive?
Well, I think the government, particularly on the scheme I roll out, say the air travel bubble or the resumption of cruise, I have made it a point that vaccination, full vaccination plus 14 days, is now the norm for going out. I think that's being imposed on Hong Kong residents for the valid reason. And I think, well, in the time to come, definitely, well, having a full vaccination, protecting yourself, would largely be the ticket for going out more. And I think, well, Hong Kong is doing that. I believe, well, around the world, people will be doing very much similarly.
I have to pivot very quickly. I have time for one last question. We have to talk about the global corporate tax that has been agreed upon, at least in principle, by G7 nations for a 15% at least floor for global corporate tax. We heard Paul Chan, the financial secretary, yesterday talk that it could put Hong Kong at a disadvantage or put some restraints on Hong Kong. We know the flat corporate tax is about 16.5%, but you incentivize investment and multinationals coming with a lot of concessions. How does this proposal impact your job as economic development and getting multinationals an attractive offer from Hong Kong?
Well, interesting. Well, low and simple tax has always been the brand name for Hong Kong since day one, right? So from the Hong Kong's perspective, we sort of have this low tax largely because we want to facilitate movement of money, people, businesses. Well, from the Hong Kong's perspective, in fact, lowering the cost of business should be a global effort instead of bringing it up or sort of imposing it on others. But I understand that, well, the sentiment globally that, well, people are concerned about cost of business. And therefore, well, from the Hong Kong perspective, we believe that, well, low and simple tax is always the best key and also the level playing field for all business to come to Hong Kong. And I think that's part of the reason they are here.